Governor, thanks for joining us. The federal government has timelines for the rollout and implementation of this new health care law. Of course, the Supreme Court decision has really brought this to the forefront as of late. The big deadline floating around that we've been hearing about is January 1st of next year for the state exchange program. Can you explain to us what's required by the state at that point?
Yeah, basically you have to point out whether you're going to have an exchange or not and what your plans are for that. And if a state does not do that, then the federal government has the right to come in and take over the exchange itself, assuming the law is upheld. In terms of the first step was the legal premise. That obviously did not happen. The change was not made yesterday. Now the next big step is November 6th and whether or not there's a new president, new U.S. Senate majority, sustained House majorities. If all those things were to move in the direction where you had a new Congress and a new president, chances are by January of 2013, the law wouldn't be in effect, or at least there'd be quick action to repeal it. And our view at the state level is why invest the time and the taxpayers' resources if that could very well change as early as next January. Instead, the law itself doesn't dictate you start an exchange, just that you have the plans for what you're going to do with an exchange by January of 2013. The exchange clearly under the law would not start till 2014.
Are those plans in place right now?
No, from our standpoint, we've stopped that. When we came in, we looked at it, and we said first and foremost, Wisconsin joined with about 24 other states that were part of this legal challenge that obviously completed through yesterday. And then we've said for months now, first stage is legal, second stage is political, meaning the November elections, and then and only then we take the time and the resources needed to look at what would happen after that.
Democrats, your critics, are pointing to your post-election speeches where you were talking about moving Wisconsin forward, bridging the partisan gap, bringing people together. Here your critics say is the perfect opportunity to do that. Your Attorney General is even saying that you have to abide by these guidelines. What say you?
Well, the Attorney General says that the law is still in effect. That's all that's in place. For us, with or without this ruling, Wisconsin or any other state could opt not to participate and just have the federal government do it themselves. Now, we'd have to weigh that option after November, depending on what the outcome was, and say, is it better for us to try and initiate our own exchange if the law wasn't going to be repealed, or just allow the federal government to do it through the Department of Health and Human Services? That's what the law outlines. That's something we've known for the last year and a half. That's not anything new to the Supreme Court decision. And again, the reminder here is, first and foremost, what we talked about was making it easier to create jobs in the state. In Wisconsin, the vast number of small businesses I've talked to have raised concerns about this unfunded mandate on them. They've raised concerns about what the Supreme Court clearly said in the ruling is a massive tax on the people of America. And we just firmly believe that we'd prefer not to have that massive tax imposed at a time when the economy is so tight in the state.
After November, if Republicans don't win the House and Senate, if Mitt Romney does not win and the incumbent Barack Obama continues his term, what then? If Wisconsin is holding off on plans, will we be behind if the Obama administration wins?
No. I mean, from our standpoint, literally all you have to show in January is what you're going to do. You don't have to have it up and running. You don't have to have it enacted. That starts in 2014. So there's a lot of hysteria out there by some of the folks who have a different viewpoint than mine. But it's not based on reality. The program doesn't start, the law doesn't kick in actual exchanges until 2014. It's merely a question of the time. It shows you how incredibly complicated and in many ways confusing it is for small businesses and employers across the state and across the country, because the federal government really doesn't have things up and running yet. They really don't know exactly what they're doing. And so, again, from our standpoint, for something that not only could be overturned, but for something that's going to change many times between now and next year, for us to spend a lot of money, taxpayers' money, and a lot of time on something that's going to change and could arguably be overturned really just isn't a very prudent use of the taxpayers' dollars.
Follow up to that question. If the Obama administration does win and Democrats prevail after November, what will be the implementation in Wisconsin after that deadline? Will you start going forward with making the plans?
Well, part of it would be trying to weigh the pluses and the minuses. Could we, under the law, something we're looking at, could we allow the federal government to do that and not have the state opt in and then have all the responsibility fall on the federal government? Because one of the concerns many governors have, both Democrat and Republicans alike, is that while there's some early implementation funding, that over time this is going to become a huge unfunded liability, a massive increase in Medicaid funded support without the funding from the federal government being sustained over time. And so there's a real question mark that I know many of us are going to talk about in a couple of weeks at the National Governors Association meeting. that even other Democrats are concerned that should they put in state exchanges, will they get burdened with the higher costs that the federal government's mandated without the money attached to it? So it's another reason why for us it's important to look between now and next January, regardless of whether it's repealed or not, as to whether or not it's in the best interest of Wisconsin taxpayers to have a Wisconsin exchange or to have the federal government take it on.
And Democrats have argued, and they were on the steps of the federal courthouse in Milwaukee earlier this week, saying that they would like to see a exchange that is more tailored to Wisconsin's needs. They're concerned, I guess, that a federal program might not follow those guidelines. Well,
that shows exactly why the law is so bad, because the last thing you want is the federal government mandating any of this. The step back and why I've argued we shouldn't have this law to begin with, and which is why it's not good for Wisconsin, is we've shown through an actuarial assessment, one that was done by the firm that my predecessor's administration hired, so it wasn't a new person for our administration, but that actuarial analysis done by the State Department of Health Services, contracted for them, showed that the majority of people in the state will pay more money for less services than they have today. Wisconsin's one of those unique states where already now, before enactment of the Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare Act, right now more than 90% of the people in the state have some form of health care coverage. Only about 6 or 7% do not. And yet we're going to ask the overwhelming majority of people in the state to pay more money for less services to try and address a national issue when we've got a good answer here in the state of Wisconsin. So my point to those who made that point in the steps is that's a pretty compelling argument for why Wisconsin shouldn't be under Obamacare at all, and instead should be empowered to act on our own to take on these health care issues, to drive down health care costs, and to make sure all our people are insured. Obamacare, the federal act, does not do that.
We've heard from a resounding number of viewers that have seen just the friction play out within the last day, wondering, what the heck is this going to mean for me? What do you have to say to that?
Well, that's part of the confusion. One of the things I've heard repeatedly over the last year as I've traveled the state is small business owners in particular wanting some certainty, had hoped that they'd have some certainty of knowing that the law would be overturned. For them, the next step is really between now and November of hopefully having some certainty after November 6th that there are going to be elected officials in Washington who are going to be willing to put the power back in the hands of the people in the states and not have this mandate driven by the federal government. But I think this, unfortunately, I think it has a negative impact on the economy, because I think for many of our employers, they're very, very concerned about what the federal government will mandate on them.
Does this holding back on the state exchange program also affect, in your opinion, negatively or positively, the perception that the state needs to come together, as you'd said, after your election?
Oh, I think if you look at the people's concerns about this, it crosses parties' lines. So this is not about Democrat-Republican issue. This is, I mean, again, there might be some people trying to take political advantage of this right now, but there's nothing that the law requires that has to be done today. It's merely by next January, Wisconsin and any other state that was going to participate has to show what its plans are. The plans for a state exchange, would the plans be for participating in the federal government doing the exchange, and obviously if things change after the election, will there be any exchanges at all, period, if the law is repealed. But there's nothing between now and then that has to be done. A lot of it's just folks kind of jumping on for political purposes. The best thing we can do is stay reasonable, not get drawn into the high partisan rhetoric on this, and instead do what's actually in the law.
Last question, because I know you're a busy man, have to go. You talked about making this a political issue. Recently, a few days ago, I think you'd kind of talked to a reporter about amassing political capital. Yeah. Is your position on this issue now with the state's exchange program a show of support for Republicans and potentially Governor Mitt Romney?
No, in our case, I mean, it really points to what we found last year when we did these studies, actuarial studies, and that is it's standing up for the majority of people in the state of Wisconsin. I think it's pretty compelling. We've got data that shows a majority of people will pay more money for less services than they pay today. I think Democrat or Republican alike, that's a pretty compelling argument that that evidence being accurate, which was actuarially based, that's pretty compelling for me to stand up and defend the majority of people in the state who would not fare well under Obamacare and instead propose an alternative.
Governor Scott Walker, thanks for your time.
Good to be with you.